No.
The meeting will begin in 1 minute. The meeting will begin in 1 minute. Thank you.
I call this meeting to order and welcome to Tuesday, December 15th Land Use Committee meeting. First item is approval of minutes from our last meeting. Do I have a motion?
So moved. Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Same sign. Okay, measure passes. Okay, first topic on our agenda here is employment nodes from Shape Sioux Falls, and Jeff Schmidt is going to be presenting today. Thank you. Welcome,
Thank you,
Jeff.
Council, for having me come today. Last month I was here giving an update on the residential market and kind of how we're doing it with Shape Places and Shape Sioux Falls. So with Shape Sioux Falls, we were looking at employment nodes, and I just kind of wanted to give that information out to the community, so again they have some more information to go on. With employment nodes, we tried to, back in 2010, group employment in our comprehensive plan. Employment's commercial, office, institutional, anything that generates employment. Now when we look at the employment nodes, and as I try to explain as we go through here, we really looked at the comprehensive plan. We do an engineering analysis, and then it goes into the zoning. So it's a multi-stage process to get through these employment nodes. Online, anytime you look at the comprehensive plan, there's these various sized employment nodes. You can see on the left-hand side, there's a regional employment node, there's a community employment node, but they're various sized employment nodes. And again, it goes back to we didn't really regulate whether it was retail or it was office. It just generated employment. Okay. Now, 2 or 3 different sections of the adopted comprehensive plan talked about how these should be laid out and how these should be defined and developed. So within the comprehensive plan, one of the sections said shape neighborhoods. So this is straight out of the comprehensive plan. Neighborhood residential areas shall generally maintain a low to medium density with transitions and convenient connections to employment centers. High density residential areas or residentially based mixed use areas are encouraged within or on the edges of employment centers or adjacent to major streets. We talk about this daily in our office with developers that came in. When you talk about transportation and land use, it's very challenging today, and it's only going to get more challenging in the future to try to build enough road network to handle everything. So this is the premise for all of shaping Sioux Falls, making sure that you have residential next to employment so that people are able to coordinate together, that they're close to where they work and where they can shop, and vice versa. If they're shopping and working here, they're close to where they're going to be living. That's how you shape a neighborhood. Now, in regards to the sections about future employment centers include all of the areas where people work, shop, play, or go to school. These areas are the economic engine of the community and are important for the continued vitality and growth of Sioux Falls. Also, land uses where people are employed can be office, retail, medical, or institutional. The philosophy of Shape Sioux Falls locates employment centers near where people live, therefore minimizing travel distances and the time between these 2 primary activities. We need to encourage development of employment centers which can be served by public transit, promote higher density housing, promote greater transit use, and develop pedestrian connections to allow safe pedestrian access. We just lost our screen. Okay. There we go. So how we do that again, here's two examples of once it's in the comprehensive plan, the technical engineering analysis. At the section of two arterials, every two arterials, and again, as Mike and I were just talking, I didn't know what was going to be at informational beforehand, but all 5 of those annexation areas we just talked about were at the junction of 2 arterial streets, each one of them. So they were all employment nodes. Prairie Meadows, the Hayes Addition, the Kappaman property, all of those are basically future employment areas. So when you look at how they're going to be developed, we would do a technical analysis. We've looked at them already. And how they lay out is basically when you have a development, and here you have at the basic intersection, how far is the next street going to be laid out? If it's going to be at 660 feet, you're only going to have 10 acres of commercial development. If it's going to be a quarter-mile access, then it's a bigger intersection, and so then it becomes a sub-regional access. And so that's kind of, again, how I point this out. We've engineered it by looking at where the roadways are, where the access points are, and how much development you're going to have at each one of these employment sections. Then, again, in the comprehensive plan, it lays out and defines what a sub-regional employment center is, what a neighborhood employment center is. It gives kind of a technical description, how many acres there is. And even back in 2010, we started to describe, for example, in a neighborhood employment center, what type of zoning should you have? In a neighborhood employment center, you should have a C1 or a C2 commercial development with supporting districts of multifamily and general office. That goes back to what this laid out, as well as what we would see for zoning at each one of these employment sections. So giving you some factual data, what you've seen today, what Mike Cooper's presented to you in the past, the numbers are astounding. Everything that we continue to see is this is a great market to be in. We have a lot of activity taking place. Back in 2010, we basically said the employment centers are the economic engine of our community. The permit makeup on manufacturing, office, institutional, or commercial, giving you a little breakdown of where that makes up the 100% of our kind of employment section. And then again, in the end, this is where I talked about last time. Every time that we go in front of Planning Commission, every time we come in front of City Council, we always talk about zoning mattering and how the land is going to be zoned. We show you the compatibility chart. We show you what the compatibilities are so that, as the arrows show you on the bottom, if there's going to be a development coming in and if it's next to single family development, on that bottom there it shows it's a 4. If it's a commercial 3 next to a multifamily development, it's going to be a 3 or a 4 so that you can see the compatibility. And that was laid out again back in 2010 on how this should be transitioned and how there should be compatibility. We kind of went through this last time with the apartment zoning. It's the same thing with commercial. On the west side of town at 26th or 41st and Marion, or on the east side at 41st and Sycamore, pretty much all the intersections are the same. When you look at the commercial zoning maps versus the aerial maps, there's commercial on the corners. This is an employment node. You have maybe some blue office around that, and then it's multifamily. So anytime that people want to go out and they can look at our maps online, they can see that at an arterial and an arterial, you're going to have commercial with multifamily around there before they get to the single family internal to the development. Then what we try to do in our ordinances is we have minimum standards already in place. So the comprehensive plan says we're going to have employment nodes at all these intersections. The employment nodes say what the zoning should be. The zoning says basically at every intersection you're going to have this, and then we tried to back it up with saying you're going to have to meet these minimum standards. The developers know they have to meet these, and we hope that, again, the property owners, the adjacent residential people go, well, as long as you guys are going to enforce these, and we do, we go, look, you have to meet these lighting standards, you have to meet these parking standards. We have standards that are enforced. What commercial is, C1, C4, what office is, what the forms are. Again, if the public has questions on those, we walk them through what the different forms are. We talked about this last time, getting the citizens more engaged, looking at an arterial street, where do the houses go? The houses go right in the middle. Businesses go on the edge. Kind of helps that transition from that busier arterial street. In conclusion, always what we're talking about, having the public contact us, coming into our office, phone calling us, walk-ins at the counters, things that we like to talk about are things that we kind of talked about already today. Land use transitions, using the compatibility chart. You can always do conditional rezonings. We have to use bulk regulations there so we're not discriminating against other property owners. We use the separation distances from single family. Buffer yards are required. Conditional uses are for consistency and raising the standards. And then I have this 2 slides to go over those. So again, I just wanted to quickly raise the bar, raise the information to the public. I know a lot of people watch this information. Get it to the land use so that you understand kind of where we are with the employment centers. Questions?
Thank you, Jeff. Any questions for Jeff? Councilor Anderson.
Oh, let's see. Well, I guess I want to discuss how flexible these rules are. And when you get into existing areas where you want to have these nodes, how do you really take a look at those in those existing areas, and how do you grow those nodes as far as especially pushing into residential?
Sure. We stay with the premise so that we don't make things up. We stay with the same premise that we basically have with these employment nodes. At the junction of 2 arterial streets, you go out to the first access point, and that's where the employment can be based upon. It's at the intersection of 2 arterial streets. We don't go outside of that. We're consistent. The developers know that. The property owners should know that. And so it goes out to the first collector street. So on the left-hand side there, you can see on a community center, if you have 1 arterial, it goes out 600 feet to the first street. And if that's where that arterial street is, that's where it stops. You don't get to spread, because at that point, if it starts spreading, where would you ever stop? So that's how we try to do it. Now, 12th Street and 41st Street are a different animal, but we go back to this and try to hold to this premise because this is the one that has worked, and it gives people a good understanding of what our standards are.
Mike Cooper, would you be available for a question?
I'm sure that's why he's here.
Mike, I guess I want to use the example of the discussion we had out on West 57th Street, just west of Louise, on that property where they wanted to do some developing there. It's on the south side, and we're told that there was a different plan. The city had a different plan for that area, but when we sort of discussed it, it seemed like there was going to be some flexibility to allow them to do what they really wanted to do in that area. You had commercial and retail to the east, and you had high-density housing on the west side. Do you want to, discuss something like, or talk about that a little bit, how you look at that, and, how we use this to develop that type of an area?
Sure, and I won't dwell specifically on that one, but just in general to follow up with what Jeff is talking about. The challenge for us is always coming up with a 20 to 25 year plan that has policies identified in it that we can use to guide development and land use decisions. And then there's always going to be variables with almost every situation, even like the 5 annexations that I talked about earlier tonight. They're all kind of different. But in general, we like to kind of stick with the model of the land use policies, and it really is based on the street network. And so when you're talking about existing streets that maybe were developed before we had the quarter mile or the half mile, that can have some impact on what kind of flexibility we would be looking at. But in most of the newer growth areas, it's pretty easy to use this model because of the way that we've managed the access and the design of our arterial roadways. So 57th Street, 69th, Louise, those are typically trying to follow the model as much as we can. But as Jeff said, when you get to the West 12th Street and the 41st Street, like with the Billion situation, then we said, okay, let's look at this employment center of 2 arterial streets. And if you look at where the collector street goes east-west, north-south, that gives you kind of the guideline of where the commercial transition is going to be appropriate. So there are situations where it doesn't fit perfectly, but we do try to be consistent as much as we can. And if we have a situation that's coming in that we need to explain or justify or support or not support, we always like to go back to the comprehensive plan and the zoning ordinance to help provide that backdrop as to what we believe the city council direction should be.
And now, do we have an updated map that shows all of these nodes now? Or is that something we're working on?
We're going to be working on an update of our Shape Sioux Falls comprehensive plan this next year. And that's one of the activities that we need to work on. But this is what we currently have out there. So it's fairly up to date, but it's not as up to date as we want it to be. And we're going to work on that with the council.
And I guess that's where my concern is just as you said, when you're in a newer area, it's easy to use this plan and move forward. But when you're in those older neighborhoods, the older part of the city, there's got to be some kind of flexibility because it's already built in.
Yes, and we understand that, and we try to work through those situations. So,
okay, thank you.
Thanks for asking.
Any other questions? Councilor Jameson.
Jeff, if you'd made a comment earlier about all the people who are watching this informational meeting, we've been talking, and I'm sure you're a part of that conversation of all the education work that you've done over the years with Shape Places and the comprehensive plan, and what you're doing today is all good. It's needed and necessary, but it is so hard to get the public to watch this channel. I'm not sure. But the idea that they get surprised, for instance, about development that's occurring near them or redevelopment that might be taking place on a 12th Street or, even what happened at 41st in Minnesota, I think surprised some of the neighbors to see how that could come back into their neighborhoods. Have you had any further discussions or considerations about or thoughts on how to engage those people, the public in general?
To engage the public all the time, not to solve the problem. I mean, we talked about it at our staff meeting today. We have Tuesday staff meetings. We talked about it again today. I was on the radio Saturday morning talking about this comprehensive plan. Again, I don't know how many people listen to the radio Saturday morning at 9 o'clock, but I was out there. I mean, you try everything, and we're always talking about it, just like you bringing it up now. You have to try all these different things to get the public informed and involved, and I'm not willing to give up and quit that, but I don't know what the solution is. So,
if I could, the only, I think you're right. Keep going. All those efforts. So recently, I know that there was a new initiative on the recycling programs within the city, and I know there's dollars set aside to advertise essentially those changes and public service announcements and others. If you had to consider I won't push you there, but I think there should be a thought at least of you know, reaching out in a different fashion other than those radio shows like you're talking
Right.
about, but essentially ads that would, if you need to know, if you want to know,
Yeah.
go to the siouxfalls.org and look at the map or something. But
More
I'm just going
outreach.
to keep pushing you and everybody else to keep pushing. I appreciate your effort.
Yep.
Any other questions?
I just have one comment.
Okay.
If you, I hope we continue this discussion here in this committee. I'd like to see maybe a discussion using the example of West 10th Street between Minnesota and Grange. The differences that we're looking at there, the future development that we're looking at, changing that over from mixed residential to a commercial or retail. And how far into these neighborhoods do we look at pushing into?
And I agree. And then I think at that point, when we're doing that, then we start looking at these minimum standards, you know, and are the minimum standards adequate? But they are the standards we have. And then going to the next slide, where we say, these are the ones that we currently have, and talking about these, because we can get right to your issue and say, yeah, but now along these corridors, let's talk about, do these minimum standards help, and do these mitigation items work? If they don't, just like what Councilmember Jamerson says, well, let's look at public involvement. What other things can we add to this list? That's what I try to do when I come here. I don't have a solution, but I want us to think about it and come up with another bullet to add to this sheet. So,
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
yeah, thank you.
Okay, our next item is going to be a discussion on the boulevard and parking strip. And let me kind of lay out the process that we're going to use here, because we'd like to have the opportunity for as much public input as we can possibly squeeze in. And looking at the clock, we have just a little over 60 minutes because we do need to conclude land use committee meeting by 6:45, so they have 15 minutes to do the changeover. And we also do want to allow a little bit of time for open discussion if we have any at that point. So I'm going to make some, and I had a chance to talk with Councilors Jameson and Anderson, and Councilor Staggers, I apologize because I did not have the opportunity to talk to you about the format that we're using. But I'm going to make just a brief opening statement, and then we're going to open it up to public input. And you'll come forward and state your name for the record. And if Denise needs assistance with spelling of your name, she will ask. And we are initially going to put a 5-minute maximum on speaking so that we give everybody an opportunity to speak. And when you do speak, please present new information or make comments that haven't previously been discussed or presented. And then once everyone from the public has had an opportunity to speak, I will invite city staff to add their thoughts and maybe respond to any questions that might have been asked earlier. And then following the staff, the city council will weigh in and have a discussion among the committee members anyway. We'll have a discussion. And if we still have time, if time permits, we do have that option of opening it up again to the public following that, because I want to have as much input as we possibly can have. I do realize that for staff and committee members that cuts into our ability to grab a bite to eat before the next meeting, but I know that I've squirreled enough away where I think I can make it through. So anyway, let me just state this before we get started here. It's our intention and desire to be more flexible with what can be planted and or placed in the right-of-way. It is our hope we can encourage conservation practices which will create vibrant and appealing streetscapes. We wish to explore options in addition to grass and trees that are currently allowed, while at the same time maintaining the functionality of the right-of-way without having an adverse effect on public safety or hindering access to public and private utilities. So, what are some of the possibilities? Allowable plants in the parking strip could include, but are not limited to these, turf or natural grasses, annual, biennial, or perennial plants including cultivated flowers and wildflowers, or even fruits and vegetables. Selected plants could be of a hardy nature and more resistant to the de-icing chemicals used in the winter months. In other words, we are open to more than just grass and trees in the parking strip. With that said, we do need to keep safety in mind. In order to promote safety and allow for safe visual sight lines for pedestrians, bicyclists, and motorists, a maximum height requirement for all plantings in the parking strip is something we need to take a look at throughout this process. So once again, our intent is to provide property owners more options without sacrificing safety, right-of-way functionality, or hindering public and private utilities. So let's get started. Once again, ground rules: state your name for the record, and a 5-minute maximum, or less, please. And as we continue, present new information or make comments that haven't been made previously. Welcome.
Bruce Danielson, Sioux Falls. Jim is going to help me out here a little bit. I was thinking about this and talking with some other people, and I just kind of put together 7 little pieces of this puzzle, and I've got a couple things that I'll point to Jim when it's time. But I agree, we need to revoke the grass only in the boulevard ordinance. It's dated. It's wrong for the environment. It doesn't work with the de-icing. Everything you've talked about, Mr. Kiley, I think it's important. I also agree that allowing the flowers and the plants and shrubs and the brick mailboxes, some of the brick mailboxes are getting huge. We've gotten a lot of issues involved with some of the rocks that are being put in. But, the rocks are easy to move. A forklift, some of the pictures that we recently saw, it looks like a forklift's going to have to come in and move them. Well, maybe they had a car go through the yard one day. We just had that in the paper the other day where another car went into a house. Maybe that was their stop on it. Who knows? But all of that stuff is movable. But I do remember back in the day with when the big discussion was about 20 years ago about the pebbles, the little pea rock that people were putting out in their boulevards, and it was washing into the storm sewer system. So when we were on, Teresa and I went around and we looked at quite a few landscaping techniques, and we saw where people actually dug down into their boulevard and made an area where the mulch and the rocks that they put in there stayed in there because they were below the height of the sidewalk, and they leveled off the sidewalk to the curb with other ground cover that was permeable. So, and when you talk about a maximum height on vegetation, if you've got a hosta may get 36, 40 inches tall, but it's just a flower that sticks up that high. It's not a big miscanthus 6-foot grass that's growing up, or somebody planting sweet corn in their boulevard. So I had a piece in here that anyway, we have the third one was it needs to be, if you're going to allow people to come in and do this additional work, it's up to the homeowner or the landowner to replant it, take it out of there, put it back in, and that shouldn't have anything to do with, because the landowners actually, or the person that planted it in the first place, is going to have the skill to move it properly and preserve it, and if it's an emergency, they can come in and wipe it out, big deal. It's sorry, but it's got to go. And I've noticed in the work that I've had the utility companies come and do at my house, they've been more than willing to go with every bit of my landscaping that I've got. The fire hydrant issue, I know in the wintertime, talking to Chief Sedaris a couple of years ago about an issue, wanted to have 36 inches around the fire hydrant. And that was for snow removal. If there's something that happens, no planting of shrubs or fences or anything else, right, to interfere with any of that in the summertime or in the wintertime. when I had there's a drawing that I did. Go with the one with the cars. We'll wait with that one. Yeah, that one. I did a little drawing here. Several years ago, about 20 years ago, I had an issue, and John Smith from the street department and Pete Nicolai came out and discussed it with me. And they came to look at my yard. Now, my front yard actually drops down quite a bit from the crown of the road. And so what would be 36 inches up from my sunken front yard is actually about 60 inches on a flat level plane, when they said what they looked at was 36 inches from the crown of the road. And that puts all the neighbors on the same level plane. Even though my yard is lower than everybody else's, I could have a taller planting bed in my front yard, and I could do things in my boulevard that didn't interfere. And so based on their rule, they were looking at, and that's what I did with the drawing here that I made, was looking at the level of somebody driving by in a car, and the height of a car was about 36 inches. And so that's what they were looking at, but from the crown of the road and not from the yard or the curb or anything else, because it's all different all over town, and this makes it at least some kind of consistency. And then I had another point I wanted to bring up, as long as we were talking about the boulevards. And having been at the joint Sioux Falls-Brandon meeting a few weeks ago, and I recorded and put it up online, and I really appreciated what the Brandon City Council was talking about with trees and the damage that these large trees are causing in the boulevards. Now, this is probably going to get me in trouble with a lot of people, but I'm going to say it anyway. I really appreciated what they had to say. And you can go out and look at the video online and understand their thought process in it. I tried to find their ordinances, but I couldn't find it. But what they actually were doing was encouraging people to plant trees to canopy the boulevard and so on their side of the sidewalk. In other words, on their property, so that way it'll canopy for many, many years to come without damaging the sewer systems, the electrical. When the gas company comes to put in new lines and they're using the thumper to go down and torpedo through the ground to get through, they aren't fighting all the roots and so on. So it's something to consider in the process. And then the last thing was another point that they brought up in there, and this goes back to Project Trim, with having the City of Sioux Falls actually hire certified arborists such as they do. And these teams would fan out through the community. They took and broke down Brandon in, I believe, in a 3-year cycle, where they were able to go through and they could trim the trees that the city already has in the boulevards that are the city's property. And I know that in several areas of town, the city actually required the developer to put trees in the boulevard, and now the homeowners are having to fight trees they didn't even want in the first place. And so that's what I wanted to ask about, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. We're a little bit over time on that presentation, but thank you for your document and for the graphics as well. Anybody else would like to address the committee?
Hi, Liz Meilenberg is my name. Lived in Sioux Falls for 41 years. This was pre-written, so. Regarding the issue of plantings and landscapings in the boulevards of Sioux Falls, I think the city has far more important issues on which to focus. The assumption is that the visibility is the major and the only issue. If taste or aesthetics or style favorability are part of the issue, that is government overreach, in my opinion. So I will proceed with the idea that visibility is the only issue, with the written understanding, and I mean written into the ordinance, that the city itself will not violate the legislation it creates or offer waivers to itself or favored citizens. Regarding the visibility issue, the city has far more serious offenses and offenders than the simple homeowner who may have a few daylilies or grasses or even small boulders in their boulevard. Foremost, to remember, there have been no accidents resulting from citizen boulevard landscaping or planting. 0, absolutely none. Let's consider the city's traffic signal boxes placed frequently and throughout our town.
Liz, could I get you to adjust the mics down just a little bit more? Thank you very much.
Here is a photo of a moderate-sized box with an adult standing in front of a box placed in the boulevard. I'm thinking 2 adults could easily hide behind it and not be seen. Some of these streetlight control boxes are even placed on 2 or more of those huge cement cubes, raising it higher. Then there are the very many and various utility boxes and poles seen and placed everywhere in our boulevards. These present are numerous and varied visibility issues, most certainly are not very aesthetically pleasing. And do not forget all the postal drop boxes or the city's randomly placed garbage containers or cement planters placed around town. One could even argue that the downtown sculptures are a visibility issue. Certainly the center boulevard immediately south of the library displays pleasing artful sculptures, but is a visibility issue. But an even bigger and far more serious visibility issue is simply street parking, as you see in the second page of photos. So I would like to conclude that you as counselors sitting here are personally charged to fairly represent the individual citizen as their personal representative in a city government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The individual citizens' boulevard landscaping and grasses or daylily planting issues are small to non-existent in comparison to the many and various government infractions. I suggest that the city government remove the log from its own eye and serve as an example rather than a focus on a minute speck in the citizen's eye. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz.
Hi there.
Welcome.
Mary Ellen Conley, also a longtime resident of Sioux Falls. And I'm here tonight to represent the Friends of the Big Sioux River and also Sioux Falls Beautiful. I did send a letter out to most of you, a long 6-page document pulling together my ideas about soil and how the right-of-way is an opportunity for you guys to do a comprehensive right-of-way ordinance that would include permeable soil in the right-of-way. And so the right-of-way could become a 3-pronged best management practice with this improved soil. So you could restore a mini riparian area. Each right-of-way would become a little mini riparian area with 24 inches of topsoil over permeable subsoil. And by that way, you get this first flush of stormwater would absorb into that riparian area. You would mitigate stormwater. You would mitigate pollution, non-point source pollution to the Big Sioux River. And you would also increase the viability, diversity, and longevity of trees and all other plants. So that's main. I also concur with the idea of growing non-turf plants, but that's already been spoken to, so I won't need to go there. So that was the main thing I wanted to address: the health of the river, the stormwater mitigation, and the diversity and longevity of our trees.
Mary Ellen, thank you very much.
I have extra copies of the document that I emailed you if you would like.
Yes.
Shall I
Jim can pass those out for us. Thank you. Would anybody else like to address the committee?
Greg Neitzer, Sioux Falls. I'm just here as a private citizen who's been interested in this for a while. I don't have a vested interest. I'm in a new development, so I only have turf grass, but that's living on a local. We don't have a lot of problems with it. Did live on a emergency snow route, and that was a much different animal. So I'll try not to cover things other people have already covered, but I guess the first thing I would say is, and I know you'll do this, let's start with the spirit of serving our citizens and honoring the pride they take in beautifying their boulevard. Let's not overcomplicate this. Whatever you do, I expect that you will expect it will be enforced. So the more stringent you make it, the more people you're going to put into non-compliance, and that's a very nice way of saying that you're going to have people who are going to have enforcement action taken on them, and with that comes civil fines and penalties, and essentially making them criminals. And we got to be very careful about doing that. There's really only two issues, I think, that come up, and that's public safety and utilities. So for utilities, as I've said before, I think we just need to ask Public Works and the private utilities what doesn't work. So I'm thinking they're going to say permanent installations of concrete and asphalt are not going to work. I'm not sure much else won't work. There might be some things like pea gravel, things like that are going to be so small they're going to wash into the storm sewer. But let's ask the people that deal with it and need to know. I'd say let's not focus on what is allowed and get into the minutia of, flowers are allowed and Russian sage is allowed, but Carl Forrester isn't. And let's just talk about what isn't allowed and make that a very small list. Let's let people be creative within reason. So as far as public safety, I think essentially we're talking about height. And then there's fire hydrants too, but really height. And I think we can come up with a reasonable number. I mean, I've heard 3 feet thrown out. It should be something reasonable when you think about all of the other things that are in the boulevard. And then as Bruce had measuring from a uniform position, such as the crown of the street. Remembering that we also have trees, mailboxes, and other things in the right-of-way right now. And maybe the big thing to focus on is this isn't a new problem, if you want to call it a problem. We have hundreds of properties that are not in compliance right now, and I'm not aware of any accidents or problems already. So we have to be careful about, I guess I would maybe say, solving a problem that doesn't exist. Now, I totally agree. We shouldn't have something on the books that we're not enforcing. That needs to be addressed. But I guess I'm just saying let's be careful not to go overboard on the public safety issue. And I guess finally I would say when I look at what the city is doing downtown, which is beautiful, and then when I look at the reconstructions of arterials, and I've had discussions with Public Works and engineering about what they're thinking about when they do this. When I look at stretches of Russell down by the arena, and then I look close to me at 41st Street going from Sertoma to TLS Road, I see beautiful, beautiful work in the medians, as an example. And you see lots of mixtures of perennials and all these things that we're talking about. And then you see the splash blocks, which helps with protecting the grasses and the other living ground cover from all the salts. And so there's a lot of diversity that they're using in the medians. And so, we could do a lot the same with the boulevard. So I guess what I'm getting at is let's honor what people are doing. They take a lot of pride in what they're doing. And let's just make it a short list. Let's not overcomplicate it. And let's keep it simple. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Good afternoon.
Hi, Teresa Staley. Say you need to turn up the heat in here. Little nippy. Anyway, and Jim has some photos here. I wanted to say I was appreciative of the comments that were made in the Argus Leader report yesterday, and I have personally driven past hundreds of properties, many of them in the southeast, southwest part of town, central part of town, where people are landscaping next to the driveway with mailboxes and daylilies and all sorts of things. I know they've hired people to do this. And at the end of the day, whatever we come up with, it will be enforced, and when these people are given notices, they have to rip things out, they will not be happy. So that's why I've been trying to get the message out, and I know some people haven't been happy with me for saying that this is the worst case scenario, but I've watched stranger things evolve out of council action. And after you're done voting on this, it's too late. So we've got to get the word out to people ahead of time. I want to talk about safety. I've lived at my property at 24th and Van Epps for 23 years. And long before I had any flowers there was a fire hydrant in the boulevard. And we had an intersection that had near misses happening quite frequently. And I called the police department. I said, or the street department, we need a stop sign here. Oh, Teresa, you have to have 3 accidents before we'll put a stop sign in. I'm like, wow. So I continued to watch these near misses and people speeding through. And finally, one day, one of my neighbors comes up he's heading south, and he gets rammed into by someone heading to the west. And I immediately called the street department. I said, now will you get right out here and you see what's happened. We need a stop sign. Remember, there were no flowers, nothing in the boulevard except a fire hydrant. Safety issue, people weren't paying attention. So guess what happened? They put up a nice red stop sign. Now I've started growing flowers, and I've said this before, my inspiration for doing my flowers was the McKinnon Park Boulevard. Beautiful Russian sage, daylilies, it's floating over the curbs, it's gorgeous. So I started doing that myself. I haven't had one accident on my property since I've been doing that, and I believe the question has been asked of Councilman Jameson, how many people have been injured, maimed, or killed because people have landscaping in their boulevard? I know we're very concerned about safety, and I'm going to take this to a different level. We can't even talk about a cell phone ban. We can't spend any energy on that, but we're spending a lot of energy talking about landscaping. Yeah, to me, it seems a little off. Anyway, I wanted to talk about the city being a leader here. We talked about the McKinnon Park Boulevard, and I have some beautiful photographs of pictures I took this fall downtown. Now, here we have the library area. You see me pointing there to the landscaping in the middle of the street. We got a big thing there. Well, I don't know what you call that big thing, but it's big, and that's in one area. Next picture, please. Daylilies, they are arching over the side of the street there, quite large, you see. Okay, next picture, and another area where it's jutting out. We've got fencing out there, we've got pavers. Next picture. And last but not least are those beautiful grasses. So I say, hey, City of Sioux Falls, you're a leader. You lead us when it comes to speeding. Our city employees, the city tells us, do not speed. Enforce the speed limit. We don't speed. The city says, well, we're going to take care of our sidewalks. When it snows, you take care of yours. Bravo. The city says, don't have weeds. We're not going to have weeds in our property. Homeowners, don't have them in your own. We take your lead. Same thing about flowers. They're leading with this. We think it's beautiful. People downtown, I think, love it. So I'm with Greg. I say, let's not fix a problem that isn't there, and keep it simple. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else like to make a comment? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to ask our city staff to add thoughts that they have on this topic, and I see we have the 3 M's and 1 S out there. We got Mark, Mike, Matt, and Shannon. Who wants to go first? Any comments that you would like to make? Mark or Mike?
Thank you, Councilor Mark Cotter with the Office of Public Works and council members of Land Use. This is, it's refreshing to get good input. We've been receiving a lot of input at City Hall to help us really, as we look forward and start to establish guidelines. So we do update, as Greg had mentioned, we've got an outdated ordinance that today is very restrictive, and that recognizing that not only on city property but also on private property, to really open that up and establish some guidelines that, as people call to ask what can we put in our parking strip, so that we can actually pull it out, something thoughtful that is current and relevant for today. And so just a couple of points that as Councilor Kiley, you'd mentioned points and that I'd heard from some of the community input. You know, the guidelines, as we see, they should promote vegetation. It is a harsh environment with having 5 to 6 months of winter. You know, that's one of the most restrictive pieces today is really it's a turf grass ordinance. And so really establishing what vegetation, some hardscape design flexibility, promote community health, as Mary mentioned, not only for the environment for the Big Sioux River. Encourage conservation practice. You know, we have a sustainability arm, and this is just another opportunity for us to promote conservation practice and do more streetscapes that when we do expand 41st Street. And there is a different purpose for a median as opposed to a parking strip when we are moving traffic and creating a safe environment, but to have really standards that speak to both. Vegetation today, as we talked about, is really turf and native grasses, but can certainly be more opened up to annuals, biennials, perennial plants, including flowers. We've gotten feedback on fruits and vegetables, and so we've been taking some of that feedback. Safety is a very important part. You know, the way that the public receives its public utilities and its private utilities, many of the boxes that were shown, you know, there's as many private utilities to serve these neighborhoods as there is public utilities. And so to keep that conduit, if you will, to make sure that the neighborhoods get their power, get their communication, get their water, wastewater, storm sewer, that's essentially all located in the public's right-of-way, and we want to make sure that we preserve that functionality. Safety is important. We talk a lot more about complete streets, and it's not just vehicles. It is pedestrians, it's bicyclists. And when we look at safety, we've got clear standards that whether it's an intersection, an alley, or a driveway, that there's industry-specific triangles to make sure that you can have some good clear sight distances and make those movements safely. Maintenance, we've heard feedback on maintenance. We are constantly in that public's right-of-way making improvements throughout the city. Whether it's public or private, the gas company in the last 5 years has put a lot of new mains in throughout the city, and they've had to be in that boulevard, so they will certainly appreciate being a part of the conversation, but also understanding the importance of what is expected if they do disturb that area from a restoration standpoint. And then last, transition. Anytime you update an ordinance, we have to have a thoughtful transition plan, and so those are more feedback that we'll be soliciting as we go through this. And so I appreciate the ability to share some comments, Counselor, and I'll let Mike weigh in.
Thank you, Mark. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you. Mike Cooper with Planning and Building Services. In taking my notes from our 5 presenters today, we have been looking at this for quite some time at the staff level, as people know. And the things that we're trying to key in on that we've heard today is, let's start out by talking about what is the function or the purpose of having this right-of-way between the sidewalk and the curb. Why do we have that? Is it for utilities? Is it for aesthetics? Is it to promote a clear area between parking and the sidewalk? So we want to kind of start out with that as we go forward and zero in on the real functionality of the right-of-way, the parking strip or the boulevard. And then we have to decide what we're going to call this area too, but we'll get there. We want to continue to talk about vegetation and non-vegetation that's going to be allowed or that's not going to be allowed. And I think that's going to be fairly easy to come up with. And maybe we take the approach of just saying what's not allowed. That might be a shorter list. The non-vegetation one is that we've talked a lot about. Non-living ground cover, the rock, landscaping, those kind of things. How do we define that? How do we describe what would be allowed or not allowed? The enforcement action, Again, I think that's going to be important as we move forward, because whatever we end up with, there are going to be people that are still going to be out of compliance. So how do we deal with those in terms of moving that forward? And then how do we communicate between now and the end with the public as far as what we're working on, what we're thinking on? Because I think the Land Use Committee is going to talk about today that there'll be more public forums after today. And I think Mark and I and our other team back here would even be willing to bring forward a draft of something that's maybe not in an ordinance format, but at least would have some talking points that could be converted into an ordinance based on what we've heard today. But we have a number of existing ordinances on the books. We have the fire hydrant clear area. We have tree planting guidelines. We have a specific requirement that in the downtown area, that's exempt from the intersection and driveway safety zones where there are signalized intersections. Within our zoning ordinance, we have requirements for the front yard, the required front yard, what kind of landscaping is needed there. And then as Mark mentioned, we have the intersection and driveway safety zones, and now we're talking about an alley safety zone. So as we've heard today, what the public is thinking about and as what we've been already researching, I think we're very comfortable bringing something forward to the Land Use Committee that you can use to continue this discussion.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Any other city staff comments? And Kurt, I didn't mean to leave you out there. I mean, we do want to hear from you if you have anything to say. Not hearing nothing from Kurt, we'll move on to committee now. Committee comments. Thoughts? Councilor Jameson.
Thank you. I think all of us have probably received some phone calls or emails regarding this topic as well, and to get them into the record and to share with you some of those that maybe were partially mentioned, but maybe not fully. Individuals who live on arterial roads who have the grass that's killed by the chemicals from the plow, they should be allowed to put splash blocks, just like the city does in their medians, so they can avoid all that maintenance. Notice of work getting done on the boulevard should be given to the homeowners, which apparently it is a common practice, but it should be required, so that the homeowner has an opportunity to move those flowers if they so choose. Recommendation of 36 inches as a height of living matter be referred. Another one was implementation of this program. The consideration was that if you were to allow 3 years to lapse, would allow the individual homeowners all across the city to become in compliance, comply with the ordinance, whatever that might be, to give them time to do this work and change it. They may have flowers that are ready to bloom in the coming season, and to tear them out could be a problem, but they may have other opportunities. Anyway, a transition period of some sort. The enforcement part. Nobody's going to like it, but it should start with some education. And there's some individuals who are willing to contribute to the development of a video, education video of, demonstrating what should be acceptable and what works and what doesn't, ideas, thoughts about how to make those boulevards beautiful. Even a rebate program was suggested for property owners who were using a tremendous amount of watering their yard, now made changes in their boulevards and reduced their bill. Some kind of a rebate program, just like we had done with toilets and dishwashers or washer machines and other things to encourage water conservation. Individuals and neighbors, individuals who are elderly or disabled, who are unable to maintain a yard, should they be given other considerations of what they can and can't do? that really wraps up most everything I have, but it does come down as well to the height. An interesting question, if I could, the just staff consider the idea of, it was brought up about making a list of what's not allowed. And do we have any other ordinances that follow that model? I mean, that would be an interesting approach, because I think that might be a good idea. I don't know that we have ordinances that are structured that way, but I'd be up for listening to that. Anyway, that kind of wraps up the comments that I've received, and phone calls and emails and other personal suggestions. So,
okay, thank you. Any other comments? Councilor Anderson.
I've met with several people and discussed over these boulevards also, and I agree with the comments of Councilman Jamison. I think one of the other things, though, that we have to make sure that is known citywide is that these boulevards belong to the city, and that if there is an emergency, we are going to go in there and deal with the emergency. We're going to remove whatever's in the way and deal with that. On scheduled maintenance, I'm all for there should be a notice that would allow people to be able to remove whatever they have, whatever design, plants, things like that out of that boulevard. And then once again, we go back in there. Once we're done with our work, we basically put the dirt back in a nice way, and then the property owner would come back in and redo their own design. But other than that, in the military we used to call it KISS, keep it simple, stupid. And I think in this case here, what we're talking about with the boulevards, it fits perfectly. And that, you know, some of the concerns, I guess, that I heard that came up to me were, the only thing I really saw was like fruits and vegetables. The only thing I'm concerned about that is the maintenance of that, making sure those fruits and vegetables don't end up in our gutters and then in our storm sewers, things like that. But other than that, I think that allowing our citizens to beautify their yards and the boulevards is a great ideal, and we should move forward with this.
Okay. Thank you, Councilor Anderson. Councilor Staggers, any thoughts on this topic?
Well, I guess my inclination is to always to try to allow the citizens as much freedom as possible when it comes to these kind of issues. And so consequently, you know, I would be inclined to say that our citizenry should be allowed to, you know, pretty much do what they want to with the boulevard. But also at the same time that they can do that, then they're also responsible for, you know, maintaining the boulevard too. But I think that's the best way to go about it, is to allow the citizenry as much freedom as possible in developing the boulevard, and because after all, they live there. Day in and day out, they live by the boulevard, and they're going to try to present something that's really nice. They're not going to have anything, you know, really crummy looking. They're going to try to have a nice boulevard.
Okay, thank you, Councilor. Councilor Anderson.
One other thing is, and since that did also come up, was the trees in the boulevard. A few years ago, we did west, I want to say 46th Street. And I think Mark's already remembering where I'm going with this. The contractor that we completely tore up the road, replaced it. Councilman Jamison and I got involved in a situation where the contractor grinded the base of the trees that were in the boulevards, effectively killing them, but left them in the boulevards. And basically after some work, we did get those trees taken out and replaced. If you look at that street now, most of those citizens put their trees on their side of the sidewalk. instead of putting it into the boulevard. And just as we had a minor discussion here, a lot of the utilities and that are in there, and then your curb and gutter, I think, you know, the city encourages people to plan in the boulevard. I wish we would move away from that, because I feel that the cost to our citizens when those trees mature are not realized when they first plant them. And I think this could be a part of this discussion also.
Okay, thank you. Like Councilor Jameson, I had a couple of comments or people that had emailed me, and I had 3 phone calls. One that did not request a return call back. 2, I did return the call, and once I basically explained to them what we're trying to do here, they felt that it was a reasonable approach. With the emails, just to give you a brief synopsis of some of them, whatever you set as a plan, it should be enforced. And I think we're all in agreement that that is the case, and it should be the citizen-owned property as well as city property. It should be even across the board, no exception. So once we do have something set, it needs to be enforced regardless who the property belongs to. This individual also goes on to say there's no reason to have anything taller than 12 inches in the boulevard. They did feel that pavers and small rock should be okay, because they did address the issues with the chemicals in the wintertime. Another individual indicated they're glad to see the City Council updating rules on boulevard plantings, because many people put a lot of effort in making their boulevards look beautiful. Any vegetation other than deciduous trees should be no taller than 18 inches. Boulevards should not have bushes, hedges, or evergreens above 18 inches. And then another individual, since we allow grass to grow up to 18 inches before it's required to be mowed, then anything should be allowed in the boulevard that is up to 8 inches. So it kind of, a lot of what I had, what was sent to me, echoes what has been stated here today. And before I open it back up again for further comment, my thought on the next step is that I'd like to keep this in land use committee, because it's a little easier to have public input in this forum than it is in others. So if we could, if city could come back with some more thoughts and ideas, maybe more specifics in January, is that possible? And then we could just flip things around a little bit. You could do your presentation, and then we could take questions from the committee, as it normally, we'll just follow the normal routine as well, or the public, and then questions from the committee. Okay. Does anybody else please step forward?
Are you freezing? Freezing.
I just have one short comment about the trees. I would suggest, if you seriously consider that it would be for newly planted trees and not go through the center of town cutting down everything that's in the boulevard.
No, it would not be older, mature trees.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Bruce.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure that that was understood from the discussion that the Brandon people had at that meeting. I thought it was a very good discussion, and actually Councilman Jameson started the conversation, and I thought it went in a really nice way. Because they were taking, as the trees died, or there was some kind of an emergency or something happened, then Brandon didn't put a new tree in that spot. They actually offered a new tree to the homeowner to put it in their side of the sidewalk. And I thought that was wonderful. A couple weeks ago I was here, and I showed this little piece about what code enforcement, this is actually from a 2008 code enforcement report audit that had been done by the audit internal auditor. And this is what happens, and this is why I went to court last year and succeeded in beating the charges against me with all of the issues, is because there is no way a citizen can follow this. So by allowing somebody to actually have a list of what's acceptable and be within reason on the acceptable, code enforcement could be that simple, you know, and we could actually have a code enforcement system that actually follows state law. As proven in my court case, the city still is not following legal process on code enforcement. Something else we should talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.
Okay, everybody.
And just another word in response to what Mike Cooper said. I'm hearing two different stories about this downtown area. He said that these flowers are allowed down there on the boulevards because you've got street lights going on. I've got a stop sign by my house. See, I don't think it's going to fly with the public if you say, well, we got some street lights, so we're going to put all these flowers along the street. We can do it. Do as we say, not as we do. Also, if you're talking about safety zones by driveways, there are big, huge, round flower pots by driveways downtown. You got all sorts of things plopped down there. So once again, this hasn't, and again, in your district, Mr. Kiley, you've got lots of people with mailboxes. There's things in that safety zone then. So we're going to open up a can of worms that's going to put down the lash on people and say, rip this out. This is our safety zone. You can't have anything within 30 feet or whatever you're going to say. And I'm saying I will help to enforce this, that the city, I just don't think the citizens are going to go along with this. Let us remember that we are the city. We all pay taxes. This is not you against us. This belongs to all of us. You are elected now. We're all moving through in different roles that we play. But we're all in this together. So it shouldn't be bureaucrats over here, citizens over here, we make decisions, you do this. No, we're in this together. We all pay the taxes to pay the salaries. So we need to be doing things that are servicing the citizens and making this user-friendly and embracing people, instead of saying we're going to come up with rules and regulations and hoops that you will jump through. Amen.
Jump in here one more time.
Mary Ellen?
So I wanted to go back over this, I didn't go over this before, but to compare the differences in topsoil in the right-of-ways in 3 different cities, Sioux Falls, Aberdeen, and Brookings. In Sioux Falls, when it comes to the right-of-way topsoil depths, Sioux Falls is like 2 different cities. The mid-century and older neighborhoods often have many more inches of topsoil than post-70s neighborhoods do. Since the 70s, the new neighborhoods have been built outside the older core area of Sioux Falls. The valuable topsoil is scraped off and stockpiled. And unless prearranged, it is common that less than 4 inches of topsoil, approximately the thickness of a driveway, are replaced, compared to the average natural depth of topsoil of 10 to 20 inches. Currently in Sioux Falls, there is rare regard to significant topsoil replacement and permeable soil conditions in the right-of-way and elsewhere, even in upscale neighborhoods. So in Aberdeen, for the sake of health and tree diversity, Aaron Keats, the city forester, has jurisdiction over the right-of-ways. So the city forester has made this happen. So when he first took office about 10 years ago, he initiated a 24-inch topsoil requirement in the right-of-ways and planting islands. That was about 10 years ago. But since then, the right-of-way topsoil depth was reduced to 18 inches. Aaron said he didn't fight that. I guess, according to our city forester, Dwayne Stahl, he said originally they tried to get 3 feet in their right-of-way in Aberdeen, settled for 24, and has since reduced to 18. But one of the things that the right-of-ways there absorb 4 to 18 times the stormwater of most Sioux Falls developments, which have less than 4 inches of topsoil. So the reason Aaron did this in Aberdeen was really for the prosperity of his trees. But as a result, they also mitigate the stormwater. And then, as I said before, it takes the first flush of that of the fertilizer, the pesticides, the herbicides, and all those things that come off the lawn. It takes that first flush, creating that little mini riparian area. So back in Brookings, the city of Brookings requires 12 inches of permeable topsoil in the right-of-way, again a buffer to absorb stormwater and lawn chemicals. In Brookings, the topsoil soaks up 3 to 12 times the stormwater than the less than 4 inches of topsoil in Sioux Falls. Thad Dreets, the City Brookings assistant city engineer, said they originally tried to get 15 inches of topsoil, but settled for 12. He said the rows are so much healthier, you can see a huge difference between the right-of-ways, excuse me, I keep saying rows, right-of-ways compared to the rest of the lawns, that they could not get the same 12 inches required. So I just wanted to give you a little update on what's happening in the right-of-way and all these advantages, and how the right-of-ways are this opportunity to create this better environment for the plants, the stormwater, and the river.
Thank you very much, Mary Ellen. Okay, we'll wrap this up with last chance for comments from the committee members. Councilor Jameson.
Thank you. I would urge us as well when the staff is reviewing this. I think there is a fair argument to be made about should there be exceptions for downtown and/or city-owned property, and I see that kind of certainly as a consideration. The other is the enforcement. No way around it. Obviously, this discussion came before, and we all kind of shunned away from it a little bit at the end because we were concerned about it, and the whole issue of maybe enforcement is a part of this that is going to become a challenge for us when somebody's boulevard is tore out because they didn't comply. So I would sense that we almost have to make our standards or suggested standards so high and so that it becomes crystal clear and obvious that the intent of a safe, sustainable, beautiful boulevard is not achieved. So it's almost like crystal clear that it's violating the spirit of the ordinance versus out there with a ruler or measuring stick or doing something only to cut off the top of a flower, you know what I mean, just to make them comply. So I think a lot of consideration needs to be put into the enforcement effort and not take that lightly, because it will be how all of the public interfaces with this. So, and it's important that we do enforce the ordinances that we have on the books. And as well, if I could wrap it up, I'd like to thank that the recommendation by Councilor Kiley moving forward with some revisions coming from the city, my ideas, and then another chance for the public to weigh in is a good approach, and a nice, slow, steady approach, and that's what I was after from the beginning. I think that's a great idea. I support that. And I want to thank everybody for coming today. I appreciate their input.
Councilor Anderson.
Took the words right out of my mouth, Councilman Jameson. The first thing I wanted to do is thank all of you that came through our weather today to make these statements. It helps give us some direction to move forward. Mark, Mike, something I'd like to hear something about, a little more about, is this topsoil ideal also, because I seen some head shaking as the lady was giving her presentation on that, and I'd like to know why we have the differences from other cities and that, and how that would work. But once again, I think we're also on the right track. Thank you, Chair, for keeping this in the land use. I think it's a worthwhile discussion to have, and perfect season to do it before we actually start seeing more growth out there. Hopefully we get a little more snow to cover everything up, but then by spring, hopefully we're in the right direction here.
Thank you, Councilor. Yeah, speaking of season, I pulled into my driveway yesterday, and it almost appears I'm going to have to go out and mow my yard. It's green and getting longer. So things are a little messed up right now, but our intent is to get this clarified and knocked out so in time for the next growing season so that our residents can plan accordingly. And one last thought that I had in terms of once we have the set of policy, you know, education, I think, is always a great approach, and maybe it's something that we as a city can work with the home builders and the landscapers, as well as the nurseries too, to help them, make them aware of what the policy is so that they can be giving good advice to the new homeowner or to the individual purchasing their product. So with that, we'll move on into open discussion, and I too like to thank everybody for being here on a kind of a nasty afternoon, evening here. So thank you very much. Now we're moving into open discussion. Any items to be discussed, committee? Hearing none, this meeting is adjourned.